How did the Roman Empire split in two? Welcome to Collapse, where giants fall. Today, we're turning back the hands of time to an era when the Roman Empire stretched from the burning sands of Africa to the dark forests of Germania, from the Atlantic shores to the edges of the East. But behind the splendor of its legions and the majesty of its forms, simmering tensions were brewing. Intrigues of the palace, barbarian invasions, rival ambitions. Gradually, the foundations crack, and in a historic breath, this colossus splits. Two capitals, two emperors, two destinies. What really happened? But before setting off on a new adventure, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss a thing. Thank you, and bon voyage. According to the most famous tradition, the founding of Rome dates back to 753 before Christ, when Romulus, after killing his twin brother Remus, is said to have traced the first defensive furrow of the future Roman cradle. This account, partly mythical, aims to explain the quasi-divine origin of the city, while emphasizing the conquering character of its first inhabitants. Ancient stories then speak of a succession of 7 kings, each associated with significant institutional achievements. Under the reign of the first sovereign, Romulus, the civic structure's foundations were supposedly laid, with the creation of rudimentary legions and the distinction between patricians, considered the elite, and plebeians from more modest backgrounds. Later, King Numa Pompilius is said to have laid the city's religious foundations by establishing priesthoods and regulating rights. Although the chronological authenticity of these reigns is difficult to prove, the essential thing is to understand how Rome gradually endowed itself with a social and sacred system, consolidating its unity. During this period known as the monarchy, from 753 to 509 before Christ, the Romans built their first walls, intended to protect the city exposed to attacks. Each new king tried to expand the agglomeration or integrate neighboring hills, an urban process justified by demographic growth and the will to control the surroundings. Religious buildings, often associated with divine legends like the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitol, played a crucial political role as religion legitimized sovereign authority. Over time, this sacralization of civil power consolidated the cohesion of the nascent Roman population, despite internal rivalries. Royal successions were not always peaceful, and as in most ancient monarchies, coups or military alliances could determine the passing of the crown. Etruscan influence strongly marked this early Rome, located to the north in the region called Etruria, which roughly corresponds to present-day Tuscany. The Etruscans had a refined culture and advanced urban skills. Rome appropriated several of their innovations, such as the use of the alphabet, largely inspired by Hellenic models spread by the Etruscans, and symbols of imperium, like the bundle of rods topped with an axe, also known as fasces. Etruscan sovereigns, notably Tarquin the Elder and Servius Tullius, are said to have erected major constructions. The Cloaca Maxima, an imposing channel intended to drain stagnant waters, remains one of the most impressive achievements of the time. Beyond the practical aspect, this work heralded Roman ambition to master its environment and erect a city suited to extended territorial control. Around 509 before Christ, the monarchy abruptly ended with the expulsion of the last king, Tarquin the Proud, whose unpopular authoritarianism led the senators to establish a new regime, the Republic. From 509 before Christ, the Roman Republic began, a period marked by the sharing of power. Instead of a single sovereign, 2 consuls, elected for 1 year, held the highest magistracy and had mutual veto power. This system, combined with the existence of a Senate composed of former magistrates, aimed to prevent autocratic drifts. However, Roman democracy was still imperfect. Only citizens registered in the comitia, popular assemblies, could vote to elect magistrates or decide on matters of war and peace. Added to this was a constant struggle between patricians, generally from old aristocratic families, and plebeians, whose growing economic role demanded political recognition. The Licinian Sextian laws, enacted in 367 before Christ, were an important step in allowing plebeians access to the consulship. Later, the Lex Hortensia, passed in 287 before Christ, made the decisions of the plebeian assemblies binding on all citizens, including patricians. During this same period, Rome first focused on the conquest of the Italian peninsula. It faced several formidable opponents, such as the Etruscan cities or the city of Veii, whose capture between 405 and 396 before Christ represented a decisive turning point. The Samnite Wars, which took place between 343 and 290 before Christ, also tested Roman resilience. This mountain people more than once forced the legions into embarrassing defeats, such as at the Caudine Forks in 321 before Christ. Finally, Rome emerged victorious thanks to tactical adaptability combined with a policy of alliances, notably with Latin and Italian cities. In less than 2 centuries, the entire central and southern Italy was placed under Roman influence, laying the foundations of a solid military and institutional power. Starting in 264. Before Christ, Rome turned towards the Mediterranean Sea. The Punic Wars, which opposed Rome to Carthage, the naval power of North Africa, completely redefined the geopolitical landscape of the region. The First War, which occurred from 264 to 241 before Christ, allowed the Romans to seize Sicily and control a strategic maritime corridor. But it was especially the Second Punic War, between 218 and 201 before Christ, that left a lasting impression. Led by the Carthaginian general Hannibal, an impressive contingent crossed the Alps with elephants to surprise the Romans on their own Italian soil. Despite several successes by Hannibal, notably the famous victory at Cannae in 216. Before Christ, Rome resisted thanks to its reservoir of troops, and, under the leadership of Fabius, known as the Delayer, adopted a strategy of attrition. Finally, the Battle of Zama, won in 202, before Christ by the Roman general Scipio Africanus, definitively ended Carthaginian ambitions and placed Rome in a position of strength throughout the Mediterranean. In the wake of this, the Romans multiplied their conquests and established their first provinces, Sicily, Hispania, which is the Iberian Peninsula, and Africa, which corresponds to the territories of present-day Tunisia. In just a few decades, Rome dominated the Western Mediterranean before embarking on expeditions to Greece and Asia Minor. This maritime and terrestrial control, often referred to with the expression mare nostrum, which means in English, our sea, guaranteed a significant influx of wealth. Gold, slaves, wheat, and many other exotic products flowed to Italy, enriching the Roman aristocracy, who then invested in agricultural estates or in sumptuous constructions. However, the prosperity resulting from the conquests also led to social imbalances. Between 133 and 30, before Christ, the Republic was shaken by profound internal crises. The agrarian reforms proposed by the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, known as the Gracchi, in the 2nd century before Christ, aimed to redistribute public lands to poor citizens. But these attempts faced fierce opposition from the Senate, protecting the interests of large landowners. Political tensions worsened over the course of uprisings, later leading to the confrontation between Gaius Marius, military reformer and popular hero, and his aristocratic adversary, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. The dictatorship of Sulla, exercised from 82 to 79 before Christ, left a lasting mark by allowing bloody prescriptions and strengthening senatorial conservatism. Shortly after, new conspiracies broke out, such as the one led by Catiline in 63 before Christ, which aimed to overthrow a regime deemed too elitist. The first triumvirate concluded in 60 before Christ between Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, attempted to stabilize the situation. However, personal ambitions remained too great after Crassus's death in 53. Before Christ and significant diplomatic setbacks, the rivalry between Pompey and Caesar intensified, leading to a civil war crystallized by the crossing of the Rubicon in 49 before Christ. Victorious, Caesar did not enjoy his power for long. He was assassinated in 44 before Christ by senatorial conspirators worried by his growing authority. A second triumvirate, bringing together Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, was formed, but it too failed due to power struggles. Ultimately, the Battle of Actium in 31 before Christ resulted in Octavian's overwhelming victory over the fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, marking the end of the civil wars and the advent of a new regime, the Principate. In 27 before Christ, Octavian, now called Augustus, received from the Senate the title of Princeps, first citizen, and presented himself as the guarantor of peace and stability. He reorganized the army by professionalizing it, created a Praetorian Guard tasked with protecting the emperor, and reformed the administration. The Principate thus marked a compromise. The Republic subsisted symbolically, but real power was concentrated in the hands of Augustus and his successors, ensuring an era of relative tranquility, the famous Pax Romana. This period, extending broadly from 27 before Christ to 180 Anno Domini, also saw the strengthening of the imperial cult. The emperor embodied the greatness of Rome and guaranteed the prosperity of the empire. Several dynasties succeeded each other at the head of the Roman Empire. First, the Julio-Claudian dynasty with Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Next came the Flavian dynasty, represented by Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian. Finally, the so-called adoptive emperors took power, a succession including Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. This last period, stretching from Trajan to Marcus Aurelius, is often considered the golden age of the empire. Trajan, an ambitious strategist, led victorious campaigns in Dacia, north of the Danube, and against the Parthian Empire, achieving a territorial expansion never equaled afterward. Under the reign of Hadrian, from 117 to 138, the empire consolidated, fortified itself, and acquired more clearly defined borders. The limes, consisting of forts, palisades, and watchtowers, delineated the regions controlled by Rome. Emperor Antoninus Pius, who reigned until 161, subsequently ensured remarkable internal peace, strengthening provincial administration and promoting economic prosperity. Everywhere, paved roads and well-equipped ports connected a geographic entity that extended from present-day England to Egypt and from Portugal to Mesopotamia. However, this Pax Romana was not devoid of challenges. The borders required constant surveillance, as neighboring peoples sometimes proved to be formidable adversaries. Internal uprisings remained sporadic, spurred by rivalries for imperial succession or a desire for independence in certain provinces. But overall, the empire maintained a balance under the watchful authority of the adoptive emperors, up to Marcus Aurelius, crowned in 161 Anno Domini. This philosopher-emperor, steeped in the Stoic heritage, embodied the quintessence of good Roman government. His principate was marked by military operations along the Danube to contain Germanic invasions. He notably confronted the Quadi and the Marcomanni in the north, testing imperial resources. Moreover, within the borders, stability increasingly depended on the army. signaling a slow shift in the political balance. Despite everything, Marcus Aurelius remains one of the most respected figures in Roman history. His death in 180 Anno Domini closes an era often considered the golden age of Roman civilization. At that precise moment, Rome still reigned over a colossal expanse, strong with well-tested institutions, a seasoned army, and widely disseminated law. Nevertheless, beneath the surface of this seemingly unshakable edifice, the first cracks of an empire that, in the decades to come, would gradually enter into crisis were already emerging. The Pax Romana, extended under the good emperors, is accompanied by cultural and urban growth. New Roman cities emerge or develop on the model of the capital, with forums, amphitheaters, baths, and grand temples dedicated to traditional gods or the imperial cult. Goods flow into Rome. Spices and precious fabrics from the east mingle with African gold, slaves from Central Asia, and agricultural products from the Mediterranean basin. In this cosmopolitan world, Latin thrives as the administrative and legal language, while Greek remains a major cultural vehicle, particularly in the eastern part of the empire. At this precise moment in history, the Roman influence reaches such a level that contemporaries see it as universal, or at least as the largest empire known in their time. Meanwhile, at the far east of the Eurasian continent, the late Han dynasty maintains its dominance over China since the 1st century Anno Domini, even though it slowly begins to show signs of internal weakness. At this time, the emperor is seated in the capital Luoyang, a cosmopolitan city located near the Yellow River, where Confucian scholars and foreign merchants converge. The Han China remains a formidable power, and the imperial court has established a complex tributary system. Several kingdoms, often located in Central Asia or the Korean peninsula, periodically send embassies laden with gifts to recognize Chinese supremacy. In return, the Han Emperor grants them honorary titles and maintains privileged trade with these vassal states. This Pax Sinica policy promotes exchanges along the Silk Road, ensuring the circulation of luxury products. Chinese silk and lacquer head west, while horses, gold, glass, and certain exotic goods return to Asia. Further south in Asia, in the region covering northern India, Afghanistan, and part of Central Asia, the Kushan Empire establishes itself as a great power. Cultural heirs of the nomadic Yuezhi, the Kushans play a pivotal role in exchanges between the Roman Empire, the Eurasian steppe, India, and China. Ruled by kings such as Kanishka, often dated to the 2nd century, they distinguish themselves by their religious tolerance and artistic patronage, notably funding the rise of Greco-Buddhist art in the Gandhara region. The Kushans control a large portion of the caravan routes crossing the Hindu Kush and the Indus Valley, facilitating the passage of spices, precious stones, and textiles. The blend of Greco-Roman, Persian, Indian, and Chinese cultures makes the Kushan Kingdom a true crossroads of civilizations, strengthening the transcontinental dynamic of the era. While these powers assert themselves on the Asian continent, the Kingdom of Axum emerges in the Horn of Africa, precisely in what is today Ethiopian and Eritrean territories. At the juncture of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, Axum fully benefits from maritime trade, linking the Roman Empire to Arab cities and Indian ports. The region is renowned for its exports of ivory, ebony, gold, and slaves, while in return, it imports wheat, wine, and manufactured products. Axum also stands out for the erection of monumental steles, the rise of a local currency, and its role as a pivot between sub-Saharan Africa and the Near East. Moreover, Axum's commercial influence contributes to the spread of new religious ideas, notably Judaism and soon Christianity, which will gradually gain a stronghold in the region. Across the Atlantic, although without direct ties to the Old World, the 2nd century Mesoamerica is marked by significant urban and cultural development. In the heart of the Valley of Mexico, Teotihuacan, whose name means the place where the gods were born in the Nahuatl language, stands as the largest city in the Western Hemisphere of the time. Its imposing pyramids, particularly the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, bear witness to the scale of its architectural ambitions. Archaeologists estimate that at its peak, the city could house more than 100,000 inhabitants, a considerable figure for a pre-Columbian city. Simultaneously, the Maya built splendid city-states such as Tikal, Palenque, or Calakmul, and developed an advanced hieroglyphic writing system and a remarkably accurate calendar. Far from Rome, these civilizations were nonetheless just as dynamic and mastered complex forms of regional trade, including the exchange of cacao, jade, and obsidian. Although no direct contact is documented between the Afro-Eurasian world and Mesoamerica in the 2nd century, it seems that a wide range of trade routes developed on each continent. From the Pontus Euxinus, the Black Sea, to the Red Sea, passing through the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, numerous maritime routes are traveled by Greek, Roman, Arab, and Indian ships. On land, the well-known Silk Road, although already active, is then bolstered by the external power of the Han and Kushans. Caravan merchants cover impressive distances, crossing deserts and mountains with camels loaded with bales of silk, spices, and precious metals. This intense movement also encourages a form of cultural dialogue. Buddhist, Zoroastrian, and Hindu religions establish themselves in Central Asian oases, while some Eastern merchants leave their traces in the markets of the Eastern Mediterranean Roman ports. Simultaneously, Rome itself becomes an economic hub, whose reach extends to the confines of the empire. Spain delivers olive oil and minerals, Gaul provides wine and wheat, proconsular Africa exports cereals, Egypt supplies papyrus and new grains, and the Roman East offers perfumes and textiles. The most affluent classes of the Italian peninsula additionally demand luxury products such as spices, pearls, and refined fabrics, which Syrian, Arab, or Kushan intermediaries supply at significant profits. Roman currency, minted in silver as denarius or in gold as aureus, circulates well beyond the official borders of the empire, attesting to the economic influence of the capital on barbarian or independent populations. Reliable maritime routes even allow some ships to reach the ports of Western India via the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea, exchanging precious metals and manufactured goods for spices, silk, and precious stones. This period sees the rise of globalized trade across the Eurasian plain and East Africa. The circulation of slaves, in particular, becomes a determining factor for the economic productivity of many empires. Rome, in particular, shows a keen interest in servile labor. Prisoners of war, individuals sold by merchants, or sometimes from indebted families. These slaves form the basis of large agricultural estates called latifundia and contribute to urban development in construction, crafts, and administration. Thus, raw materials, luxury commodities, and even human beings are integrated into a transcontinental exchange network governed by supply and demand across thousands of kilometers. Benefiting from a solid administration and a disciplined army, the Roman Empire thrives in this delicate balance. It is powerful enough to defend its borders and command admiration, yet sufficiently open to encourage mercantile traffic with other distant regions. It can rely on multiple, more or less direct alliances, eastern city-states under partial domination, client kingdoms east of the Danube, or Arab tribes negotiating the security of caravan routes south of Syria and Judea. For their part, the Han China, the Kushan Kingdom, and Aksum strive to perpetuate their prosperity by cultivating their respective exchanges. Each state maintains its own internal administration system with complementary trade routes. In the 2nd century Anno Domini, the Roman Empire seemed almost unshakable, bolstered by its vast provinces, well-oiled administration, and disciplined armies. Yet, beneath the surface of this apparent power, cracks would soon begin to form. Between 180 and 235 Anno Domini, the first signs of fragility appeared, revealing the internal tensions of the regime and external threats that would gradually erode the imperial stability. To better understand this pivotal period, let us first return to the year 180, when Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors, passed away, leaving the throne to his son Commodus. Marcus Aurelius had ruled with recognized wisdom, notably ensuring the defense of the Danubian frontiers against barbarian incursions and maintaining harmony within the Roman Senate. However, his succession did not follow the traditional pattern of adopting an heir recognized for his virtues. On the contrary, he directly transferred power to Commodus, his biological son. This transition marks a turning point. After several generations of emperors chosen for their competencies, Rome found itself with a sovereign considered too young and inexperienced. Commodus was barely 19 years old when he succeeded his father. Ancient historians, such as Cassius Dio and Herodian, describe an unpredictable ruler more concerned with his passion for circus games and courtly life than with the concrete management of the empire. Reigning until 192, Commodus then led the empire into a phase of instability. In the initial period, he sought to consolidate peace at the borders, preferring to negotiate with certain Germanic peoples rather than continue long military campaigns. However, his distrust of the old Roman aristocracy and his attraction to luxury and flattery quickly distanced him from traditional institutions, particularly the Senate. Many senators, outraged by his violence and authoritarianism, plotted to overthrow him. Commodus responded with a series of executions and political purges, worsening the climate of fear and mistrust at the heart of the capital itself. Moreover, the young emperor's extravagant spending and lack of interest in governance paved the way for corruption within his circle. Courtiers, sensing their master's political weakness, competed in intrigues to gain favors and influence. At the same time, the Roman army, stationed on the frontiers, felt increasingly neglected. The soldiers, essential to the defense of the empire, noticed this indifference and began to place growing trust in their officers. The internal power balance among institutions slowly tilted in favor of military power, while the Senate lost any real influence over the daily management of the state. Finally, after a reign marred by the opprobrium of many ancient historians, Commodus was assassinated on the night of December 31st, 192. He was strangled in his bath, the victim of a plot involving members of his personal entourage. At the dawn of the year 193, the Senate immediately recognized Pertinax as the new emperor, hoping to restore a form of collegiality and institutional balance. Pertinax was a respected senator, a former governor, and an experienced military man. His reform program was ambitious: economic recovery, moralizing public life, and restoring calm dialogue with the Senate. Alas, Pertinax would remain on the throne for only a few months. Very quickly, his efforts at financial discipline irritated the Praetorian Guard, an elite corps stationed in Rome and tasked with protecting the emperor. This military elite, corrupted by Commodus's largesse, refused the budgetary rigor imposed by Pertinax. In March 193, a mutiny erupted. A group of Praetorians stormed the imperial palace and assassinated the emperor. Immediately, the conspirators committed an unimaginable act in Roman history. They put the empire up for auction. This is a famous and particularly shocking episode for contemporaries. Each potential candidate for the throne presented himself before the Praetorian Guard, offering a sum of money to secure the soldiers' loyalty. Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, thus wins this grim auction. He commits to paying a considerable bonus to the Praetorians, hoping to ensure his security and authority. However, his purchase of the imperial title only meets with reproach and disgust from the people, honest senators, and the legions stationed in the provinces. His authority is immediately contested. 3 generals, each at the head of a powerful army, then demand the punishment of the Praetorian Guard and the end of this masquerade. Among them, Septimius Severus, governor of Pannonia, a region corresponding to part of present-day Hungary, emerges as the most determined contender. Septimius Severus ascends to the throne and marches on Rome with his troops, receiving support from a large part of the legions. He eventually has Didius Julianus executed. He dissolves the Praetorian Guard, guilty of Pertinax's assassination. On the surface, the victory of Septimius Severus reinstates order. He is proclaimed emperor and seeks to legitimize himself by presenting as the spiritual heir of Marcus Aurelius. He even deifies Pertinax, a sign of a return to a form of respectability. But in fact, his reign further accentuates the imbalance in favor of the armies, which he needs to solidify his power. Severus profoundly reforms the military organization. Indeed, he increases the pay, allows the marriage of soldiers, and ensures to reward their regional loyalties. This policy has a direct effect on the state's finances, already weakened by previous abuses. Meanwhile, the Senate, which distrusts an emperor from North Africa in the region of Leptis Magna, now Libya, sees its role undermined by the rise of military officers in the imperial hierarchy, a phenomenon that definitively enshrines the army's grip on Rome's affairs. Senators retain titles and honorary positions, but they exercise almost no real power. At the same time, at the borders, several peoples take advantage of internal troubles to test Roman resistance. On the Danube and beyond, the Sarmatian tribes, a feared cavalry people, multiply raids. To the west of the Rhine, new Germanic confederations, like the Franks and Alemanni, organize in alliances to reinforce their positions. Their objective is not yet mass invasion, but rather pillage and commercial pressure. The Roman garrisons must redouble their efforts to maintain control of the limes, the fortified borders, notably in Upper Germania and Raetia. In the east, the Parthian Empire, long a traditional adversary of Rome, is experiencing a renewal phase. Despite the defeats that Trajan and other Roman generals inflicted on it in the previous century, this power continues to contest Roman domination in Mesopotamia. Under the reign of Septimius Severus, campaigns in the Orient managed to contain Parthian ambitions at the cost of significant logistical and financial efforts. However, from 224 Anno Domini, the Parthian dynasty of the Arsacids is overthrown by a new power, that of the Sassanids, led by Ardashir, the thirst of the Romans, already tested by the complexity of the internal situation, will soon have to confront this new threat, even more resolute and offensive, as the Sassanids consider themselves the direct heirs of ancient Persian glory and intend to rival Rome. After the death of Septimius Severus in 211, the empire successively passes to the hands of his sons, Caracalla and Gaeta, whose rivalry tragically concludes with the assassination of Gaeta in 212. Caracalla stands out by the publication of the edict known as the Edict of Caracalla in 212, which grants Roman citizenship to almost all free men of the empire. This measure, while broadening the tax base and the notion of Roman identity, is not enough to halt the erosion of finances and the dependency of emperors on the legions. Caracalla himself is assassinated in 217 during a campaign against the Parthians. In this succession of coups, murders, and usurpations, the imperial image degrades and the moral authority of Rome wanes. The Senate, kept at a distance, has hardly the means to propose a solid alternative. The Praetorians, even after their reorganization, continue to see in the imperial figure a means to enrich themselves or serve their particular interests. The provincial legions, for their part, become increasingly likely to proclaim their local leader emperor if the central empire appears weakened, or if it delays in paying them properly. Beyond internal tensions, Rome must contend with the proliferation of threats. The Germans, including the Alemanni Confederation, are becoming bolder. The Franks are also beginning to make a name for themselves in regions near the Rhine. In Eastern Europe, the Sarmatians, established notably in the Pontic steppe, are testing Roman resilience. On the diplomatic front, containing all these fronts at once is becoming difficult, especially since the war against the Parthians, then the Sassanids, is mobilizing a significant portion of the military forces in the east. These early decades of the 3rd century already foreshadow the reality of growing instability as the Roman zenith gives way. The succession of emperors fails to establish a lasting power, and the rise of provincial armies heralds a new era in which the imperial title is often won by force. The finances, undermined by incessant military expenses and corruption, struggle to sustain this prolonged effort. Despite their solidity, the trade routes can no longer alone guarantee the supply and prosperity of bygone days, especially when the borders threaten to crumble. The traditional authority of the Senate diminishes day by day, while emperors, more inclined to satisfy their troops than to seek political consensus, alienate the old Roman aristocracy. Between 235 and 284, numerous emperors succeed one another at a rapid pace, while political unity, fragments, and sanitary and economic catastrophes shake the stability of Rome. For an international audience unfamiliar with this history, it is essential to explain in detail how this crisis developed, how Roman institutions attempted to adapt, and in what global context all these changes took place. It all begins in 235, when Emperor Severus Alexander, known as Alexander Severus, the last representative of the Severan dynasty, is assassinated by his own troops during a military campaign. His reign ends abruptly, paving the way for what historians call the era of the soldier emperors, sovereigns who gain and lose power primarily through the support of the military. In this span of barely half a century, no less than 26 official emperors, also called Augusti, are recorded, not counting the ephemeral usurpers that arise in different regions. Each military leader can potentially claim the imperial purple as long as he manages to rally the loyalty of some part of the legions, situated on the edges of the Rhine, the Danube, or in the east. This political instability has many causes. On one hand, the Roman legions, present on several borders, especially facing the Germans in the west and the Sassanids in the east, play a decisive role in the rise to power. Soldiers expect financial largesse and land rewards, constantly mobilizing the imperial treasury. On the other hand, The geographical distance between Rome and the conflict zones makes central control difficult. The Senate, once at the heart of political decision-making, sees its influence diminish in favor of military leaders capable of rapidly intervening in theaters of operations. The institutional weakening fosters the emergence of internal conflicts and local rebellions. Alongside this rapid succession of emperors, the Roman Empire experiences temporary but particularly significant territorial fragmentations. Two rival entities emerge between 260 and 270. To the west, the Gallic Empire, and to the east, the Palmyrene Kingdom, founded by the clan of Odenathus, then led by the famous Queen Zenobia. The Gallic Empire is born under the impetus of Postumus, a distinguished general who proclaims himself emperor and controls several western provinces, namely Gaul, Hispania, and Britain. He manages to establish a parallel administrative structure with its own local senate and currency to guarantee the defense of the Rhine borders. Meanwhile, in the east, Palmyra, a caravan city in present-day Syria, plays a crucial role in the defense against the Sassanid Persians. Taking advantage of the weakness of the central power, Odenathus gains quasi-imperial powers. Upon his death, his widow Zenobia asserts her authority and leads a true Palmyrene state, which extends over a significant part of Asia Minor and Egypt. Elegant, cultured, and endowed with a remarkable sense of diplomacy, Zenobia implements an expansion policy to strengthen her position against Rome. This Palmyrene kingdom, however, remains ephemeral. Emperor Aurelian reintegrates it under Roman rule in 273 after a series of very harsh military campaigns. In addition to these political divisions, the Roman Empire suffers a sanitary catastrophe that worsens the situation, the so-called Cyprian Plague. This epidemic is named after the Bishop of Carthage, Saint Cyprian, who describes it in his writings. Active over several decades from around 250, the plague decimates urban and rural populations, simultaneously weakening the army's ability to mobilize on numerous fronts. Sources from the time report very high mortality rates, although it is impossible to provide a precise statistic. The demographic and economic repercussions of this pandemic upend all of Roman society. A lack of agricultural labor, depopulation of entire regions, and difficulties in raising taxes. Faced with the widespread crisis, the morale of the population degrades, and new millenarian cults emerge, challenging the old Roman religion. Economically, the crisis only worsens. Confidence in the imperial currency, the silver denarius, has already been shaken since the late 2nd century. To finance military campaigns and buy the loyalty of troops, many successive emperors proceed with the devaluation of the currency. They reduce the precious metal content of coins while increasing the quantity minted. The result is runaway inflation. Prices climb and commercial exchange becomes problematic. To attempt to restore some stability, some emperors, like Aurelian, who reigned from 270 to 275, attempt to reform the currency and shut down clandestine mints. Despite these sporadic efforts, confidence in the denarius continues to collapse, contributing to the state of permanent crisis that plagues the empire. In the east, a new power rises in parallel, namely the birth of the Sassanid Empire in 224, following the defeat of the Parthians by Ardashir I. His son and successor, Shapur I, proves particularly threatening to Rome. He takes advantage of Roman instability to launch several victorious offensives in Mesopotamia and as far as Syria. The Roman army, weakened by internal strife and epidemics, suffers heavy losses. Shapur captures numerous frontier fortresses and forces Emperor Valerian to face a perilous military situation. The most famous, and undoubtedly the most humiliating, anecdote for Rome occurs in 260, when Valerian is captured by Shapur I. It is an event of unprecedented magnitude. Never before had a reigning Roman emperor been captured by a foreign power. Ancient accounts differ on how Valerian was treated. Some mention that he was held until his death, perhaps forced into public humiliations during Sassanid ceremonies. In any case, this capture symbolizes Rome's weakness and its inability to effectively defend its eastern borders. While Rome falters, other civilizations are also undergoing great changes. In Central America, the 3rd century coincides with the peak of the classical Maya civilization. City-states, such as Tikal or Calakmul, develop around pyramidal temples and maintain sophisticated trade and diplomatic relations. The Mayans are not directly in contact with the Roman Empire, but they constitute another dynamic civilization hub, albeit distant. In China, the Han dynasty collapsed in 220, giving way to a period of fragmentation known as the Three Kingdoms, which are Wei, Shu, and Wu. Endless wars, court intrigues, and peasant uprisings, such as the Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184, plunged China into a prolonged phase of political chaos. This Chinese context offers a striking parallel with the fragmentation of Roman power. Two empires with a long imperial tradition collapse almost simultaneously, each suffering from civil wars and epidemics. Despite this apparent debacle, some Roman soldier emperors attempted to restore order and revive the greatness of Rome. Among them, Gallienus, who reigned from 253 to 268, led several reforms, notably by giving more responsibilities to cavalry officers and trying to limit the influence of the Senate in favor of imperial authority. On his side, Claudius II, known as the Gothic, who reigned until 270, achieved military victories against Gothic invaders, earning a measure of renown. But it was especially Aurelian who managed to reintegrate the Gallic Empire in 274 and reconquer Palmyra, thereby ending the main secessions. He thus earned the nickname Restorer of the World, or Restitutor Orbis. Nevertheless, Aurelian was assassinated in 275, once again illustrating the extreme fragility of the imperial function. In these circumstances, the very idea of empire and unity was called into question. Local populations, whether in western or eastern provinces, often prioritized their immediate survival, seeking protection from the nearest garrison, or sometimes making pacts with enemy leaders. The idea of imperial legitimacy continued to exist, but was challenged by the pressing need to maintain local order, secure crops, and preserve basic trade exchanges. The centrality of Rome, once uncontested, diluted in favor of other regional centers. At the end of this turbulent period, in 284, Diocletian's accession to power marked a decisive turning point. Without delving into the details of what followed, as that is another story, we can nevertheless note that he undertook substantial reforms to end the institutional and military crisis, plaguing the empire for half a century. The foundations of what would later be called the Tetrarchy were laid, setting the stage for a new imperial organization. Diocletian came to power in 284 Anno Domini, at a time when the Roman Empire was undergoing significant turmoil. For several decades, imperial succession had been marked by violence and uncertainty. The so-called soldier emperors succeeded each other rapidly. Some provinces rose in revolt, and external threats appeared across various borders. Diocletian, of modest origin and likely born in Dalmatia, the coastal region of present-day Croatia, understood with clarity that the empire, too vast to be managed from a single decision-making center, had to be thoroughly reorganized to avoid collapse. His reign, which extended until 305, was marked by profound changes affecting administration, taxation, the military, and religious life. From the outset, Diocletian identified the need to stabilize how authority was exercised. The sudden disappearance of many previous emperors, often while on military campaigns or victims of coups, underscored the fragility of the era. Thus, in 285, he decided to appoint an associate, Maximian, whom he named co-emperor. This first step initiated a form of collaboration at the top, aiming to better distribute the management of provinces and to enhance responsiveness to military emergencies. Diocletian reserved the East and Egypt for himself, while Maximian administered the West and North Africa. However, this initial division proved insufficient, as threats multiplied at Europe's borders, and the mere diarchy was too limited to cover all territories. This gave rise to the idea of a finer division of imperial power. In 293, Diocletian completed this organization by instituting the Tetrarchy, literally government by four. Alongside him and Maximian, he placed two Caesars, Galerius and Constantius Chlorus. Each of these Caesars was meant to assist, and in theory, succeed in Augustus, with Diocletian and Maximian being the two Augusti. Through this mechanism, the principle of heredity was no longer the sole rule. The idea was to groom competent political heirs, selected for their military and administrative qualities. Moreover, this system aimed to prevent usurpations and avoid that the assassination or death of an emperor would cause a power vacuum. Each tetrarch administered a distinct part of the empire, had their court and army, while recognizing the protocol supremacy of Diocletian. This political overhaul is accompanied by a major administrative reorganization. Diocletian introduces a grid of dioceses, vast districts encompassing several provinces. Previously, the provinces created during conquests sometimes proved too large to govern. Now, the total number of provinces is significantly increased, allowing for closer proximity to local power and more effective fiscal control. Each diocese is placed under the authority of a vicar, also known as a vicarius, who is himself subordinate to the praetorian prefect. This change aims to relieve the emperor from the daily management of territories that have become gigantic. At the same time, Diocletian more clearly separates civil and military functions. Previously, a provincial governor could hold both roles, which sometimes encouraged personal ambitions. Now, each administrative unit has a civil servant for political and fiscal affairs, while military authority is entrusted to a separate commander. This division ensures a more specialized distribution of tasks and, in principle, limits the risk of usurpation by a too powerful governor. The issue of taxation represents another essential project. Wars on multiple fronts are expensive, and the empire struggles to maintain its legions, its fortifications, and its imperial administration. To address this, Diocletian implements a strict system of census and taxation often referred to as capitatio jugatio. The principle is to tax individuals through capitatio and lands through jugatio more systematically in order to improve revenue collection and equitably distribute the burdens. Comprehensive surveys of agricultural land area, soil productivity, the number of taxpayers, and labor force are conducted. Even though it is difficult to know the exact calculation method in detail, the result is a more centralized mechanism that regularly involves re-evaluations to account for local realities. Landowners, now subject to clearly measured taxes, must also provide goods or workers to meet the needs of the army and the bureaucracy. To consolidate this new fiscal system and ensure the availability of artisans and workers in vital sectors like food supply, armament, and transport, Diocletian issues the Edict of Corporations. It is a set of measures that partially freezes professions, prohibiting individuals from leaving their trade or the corporation to which they belong. For example, a baker must remain so, and his sons are compelled to continue the same activity to ensure a constant supply for urban populations. The desire to prevent the exodus or reconversion of certain professional categories reflects the fear of a shortage of skilled labor. This arrangement protects the empire from socio-economic disorganization while strongly restricting individual freedom. The state, as a priority, wishes to maintain order and supply the army, even if it means sacrificing social mobility. In parallel, Diocletian seeks to strengthen the Roman military system. The external threat is felt on the borders along the Danube, in Mesopotamia, and on the Rhine, while internal weaknesses remain, as civil peace is fragile and any weakening of central authority could encourage new revolts. To address this, the Tetrarchy focuses first on fortifying the limes, that is, the border areas. Forts and watchtowers are rehabilitated or built, and local garrisons are ensured to be equipped and ready to swiftly repel enemy incursions. Most importantly, Diocletian promotes the formation of a mobile army called comitatenses, designed to move quickly wherever pressure is greatest. This intervention force, placed directly under the authority of the emperor or a Caesar, guarantees increased vigilance. Comitatenses units receive better equipment and form the elite corps capable of containing an invasion or swiftly quelling a rebellion. The Tetrarchic organization is not just a simple military or political subterfuge, it is accompanied by a profound transformation in how the emperor is perceived. Diocletian breaks with the still symbolically prevailing republican tradition, where the emperor was considered the first of the citizens. He now calls himself dominus, or master, and establishes a true court etiquette. The emperor keeps his distance from the people, surrounds himself with ceremony, and introduces new rites that sanctify his person. This evolution strengthens the imperial legitimacy, now tinged with the sacred, and contributes to isolating the emperor from the ordinary political arena. The sovereign becomes a nearly untouchable figure, which limits familiarities and, in Diocletian's mind, should deter conspiracies. However, one of the darkest and most enduring facets of Diocletian's reign remains his stance towards Christians, who face severe persecution starting in 303. During the first 3 centuries of the empire, persecutions were often localized or sporadic, depending on the whims of certain governors or emperors. Diocletian, determined to reaffirm religious cohesion around traditional cults, decides on a massive and codified persecution. This initiative is also attributed to the influence of Galerius, his Caesar, known for his zeal toward the old gods. The edicts of 303 and 304 order the destruction of Christian places of worship, the arrest of community leaders, and require all citizens to offer a public sacrifice to the gods of Rome. Christians refusing to comply see their properties confiscated and risk death. These great persecutions, among the most violent of late antiquity, aim to purge the empire of religious dissidents considered subversive. The consequences are tragic, and thousands of believers are imprisoned, tortured, sometimes executed, prompting an exodus to more tolerant or protected regions. Paradoxically, this repression strengthens the internal cohesion of Christianity, which, after these trials, emerges more structured and more visible for the subsequent generations. However, Diocletian's religious policy is not limited to Christians. He actually seeks to unify the empire around a common religious system, viewing any cult that might question imperial authority with disfavor. In this logic, the restoration of pagan traditions and Roman rites is presented as a guarantee of stability. Public sacrifices are meant to seal the accord between the state and the gods, ensuring military and economic prosperity. Indeed, Diocletian undertakes the restoration of temples and the promotion of the imperial cult in all provinces, thus unifying the populations around the same official religious benchmark. Despite these sometimes drastic measures, Diocletian's and the Tetrarchy's set of reforms reflects a deep desire to save the empire from disintegration. The provinces, now better organized into dioceses, are easier to monitor. The separation of civil and military powers reduces the risk of local seditions. Taxation, although heavy, finances the maintenance of troops and the state apparatus. The trades are stabilized, even though individual freedoms are heavily affected. Finally, the Tetrarchy offers a system of alternation and potential succession thanks to the Caesars, supposed to succeed the Augusti in an orderly manner. At the same time, the mobile army of the comitatenses enhances the ability to respond to external threats. In 305, Diocletian, after 20 years of power, voluntarily retires, an almost unprecedented act in Roman imperial history. He abdicates in favor of the Caesars, who then become Augusti, hoping this model will endure. The choice to retire to his residence in Nicomedia, then to end his life in a sumptuous palace in Split Dalmatia, illustrates his desire to see the logistics of government function without his presence. Nevertheless, shortly after his departure, rivalries appear among the Tetrarchs, proving that this organization, as innovative as it was, required a firm authority to maintain balance. In the early years of the 4th century, the Roman Empire is confronted with a complex political situation inherited from the reforms of Emperor Diocletian. In 305 Anno Domini, he voluntarily abdicates, giving way to a new generation of leaders supposed to share power within a system called the Tetrarchy. This organization provides for 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars, distributed among various regions of the empire to better address external threats and prevent any abusive concentration of authority. However, this model, although innovative, quickly encounters the individual ambition of certain tetrarchs and divergences between military and civilian elites, leading to a series of internal conflicts that will shape the political and religious evolution of Rome for a long time. The death or retirement of several sovereigns, such as that of Augustus Constantius Chlorus in 306, immediately causes significant turmoil. From this moment, his son Constantine, very popular among the troops stationed in Britain, which corresponds to part of present-day United Kingdom, is acclaimed emperor. Yet, according to the official protocol of the Tetrarchy, the succession should have been organized in consultation with the other tetrarchs. Constantine thus finds himself at the heart of an institutional controversy. Meanwhile, Maxentius, son of the former Augustus Maximian, asserts himself in Rome and also proclaims himself emperor. These rivalries undermine the tetrarchic model as several contenders for the supreme title emerge, each seeking to legitimize his authority with the army, the Senate, and the provinces under his control. By 307, tensions rise. Maximian, who had abdicated simultaneously with Diocletian, abruptly returns to the forefront to support his son Maxentius. Seeking to consolidate their positions, father and son attempt to maintain influence over Italy and North Africa, while Constantine, at the head of Gaul and Britain, aspires to expand his sphere of power. At the same time, Augustus Galerius, tasked with preserving balance, is immediately threatened by the rise of another distinguished general, Licinius, promoted to the rank of Augustus, to face the rise of Maxentius and Constantine. Severus II, previously designated to replace Constantius Chlorus, is ultimately eliminated, further increasing the fragmentation of the imperial political landscape. During the years 308 and 309, alliances form and dissolve in a climate of near-constant conflicts. Maximian falls out with his son before temporarily attempting to align with Constantine. However, this aborted reconciliation ends with Maximian's definitive disgrace. The political battlefield becomes increasingly limited to two major forces, that of Constantine, supported by the Western legions, and that of Maxentius, solidly established in Rome. Licinius, for his part, retains Illyria and the Balkans, while a few peripheral usurpers vie for smaller regions. In this mosaic of imperial ambitions, civil war becomes a constant, with each confrontation risking a decisive shift towards an authoritarian regime dominated by one of these contenders. In 312, the situation abruptly changes. Constantine leaves Gaul and moves on Rome to confront Maxentius. According to later accounts from Christian authors, he allegedly, on the eve of the decisive battle, received a celestial vision advising him to have a symbol related to Christ painted on his army's shields. On October 28, 312, near the Milvian Bridge on the Tiber, Constantine defeats Maxentius. The latter's body is found in the river, marking the end of his reign and the triumph of the new Western strongman. Constantine henceforth presents himself as the legitimate ruler of Rome, benefiting from an almost sacred aura reinforced by the account of his divine sign. At this moment, the progression of Christianity becomes closely tied to imperial destiny, a major turning point in Roman religious history. Quickly, in 313, Constantine reached an agreement with Licinius, who controlled the East, to issue the Edict of Milan. This document, more than just a political agreement, established true freedom of worship within the empire. It proclaimed the cessation of the persecutions that had previously been directed against Christians and granted them the possibility to openly practice their faith. The edict did not elevate the Christian religion above other cults, but it removed all forms of repression, putting an end to the period of religious instability inherited from past anti-Christian policies. For the Christian communities, already numerous in the East, it was a relief and recognition that allowed them to gain new legitimacy, especially in urban spheres and among intellectuals seeking to reconcile their Greco-Roman education with the rise of this monotheism. Meanwhile, great social changes were shaking the empire. In the West, the financial efforts aimed at supporting the army, combined with civil wars, undermined the prosperity of the cities. Cities, once proud of their walls, aqueducts, and baths, struggled to maintain them. Entire segments of the population left urban centers for the countryside, hoping to find stability in arable land. The urban economy, based on trade and local craftsmanship, suffered from a scarcity of labor and a decline in exchanges. In the East, on the contrary, new Christian elites emerged, sometimes supported by influential bishops. The charitable role played by these religious communities attracted numerous converts and granted the nascent church a moral and even political power in some key cities, like Alexandria or Antioch. This gradual establishment of a new order coincided with major developments in other regions of the world. In India, it was the beginning of the Gupta Empire, founded around 320 AD, under the leadership of its rulers, including Chandragupta Thufir. A cultural and scientific golden age developed, supported by the rise of trade, linking the Indian subcontinent to the Near East and the Mediterranean. Art, poetry, and architecture flourished in royal courts, while Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism continued to influence broad segments of society. Further north, in the vast Eurasian steppes, the Huns began migrations directing them towards the Don Basin, at the edge of areas controlled or linked to the Roman Empire. Although their advances were not yet causing massive concern at this stage, they foreshadowed future pressures on Roman borders, notably in Eastern Europe. Despite an initial agreement born from the Edict of Milan, Constantine and Licinius gradually drifted apart between 313 and 324. Constantine, confident in his military successes and relying on strong popular support in the West, sought to strengthen his personal authority. Favorable to Christians, he saw in this faith a potential cement for the unity of the empire, especially since the new religion offered a hierarchical structure and moral discipline likely to consolidate social order. Licinius, on his part, remained more circumspect. He tolerated Christianity but feared Constantine's growing influence over the imperial sphere, particularly in Illyria and the Balkans, because controlling these strategic regions meant controlling crucial trade and military routes. In 324, the rupture was complete. Constantine launched a vast offensive against Licinius, determined to impose his supremacy over the entire Roman world. The battles of Adrianople and Chrysopolis sealed Licinius's fate, forcing him to surrender. Henceforth, Constantine ruled unchallenged. This final victory definitively closed the chapter of the Tetrarchy, marking the return to a unified imperial monarchy, where all authority was concentrated in the hands of a single man. Emerged from these civil wars, Constantine's power would benefit not only from the prestige attached to his military success, but also from the progressive alliance with Christian dignitaries, who found in him a protector sensitive to the spiritual and institutional stakes of their faith. Beyond these events, Constantine's victory closed the era of the Tetrarchs and gradually established a more unified imperial monarchy, which he himself intended to embody. When Constantine came to sole power, the political map of the Roman Empire was in full reorganization. For decades, internal rivalries pitted emperors against usurpers, while significant threats at the borders constantly demanded the attention of the legions. In this tense context, Constantine sought to consolidate his authority and ensure the lasting security of his territories. One of the first flagship measures of his reign was the decision, a few years later, to found a new capital capable of symbolizing imperial unity and serving as a strategic pivot between Europe and Asia. Thus was born Constantinople, officially dedicated in 330 Anno Domini, and destined to become the administrative and military heart of the empire's eastern part. To understand the importance of this choice, one must first highlight the exceptional geographical situation of the future Constantinople. It rises on the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium, founded around the 7th century before Christ. Not far from the meeting point between the Sea of Marmara and the Black Sea, this site overlooks the Bosporus, a vital strait separating Thrace, located in Europe, from Anatolia, located in Asia. Since antiquity, this passage has been one of the most important commercial and military corridors of the Mediterranean world, connecting the Aegean Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean to the rich regions of the Black Sea. Constantine immediately perceived the interest of a city that would allow controlling this naval and terrestrial artery. The political and military climate at the beginning of the 4th century, Anno Domini, prompted the emperor to strengthen the Roman presence in the east. The empires and kingdoms bordering the Euphrates regularly threatened Roman stability, forcing commanders to deploy significant forces to protect the east. At the same time, the old western pole, Rome, remained symbolically central, but its distance from major borders and its historical weight made it less flexible in directing and defending the empire's vast possessions. Constantine deemed it necessary to have a new administrative base oriented toward the most active conflict zones while controlling a major commercial hub. Byzantium, with its vast natural port and natural defenses, perfectly met this objective. In 330, the city was solemnly inaugurated under the name of Constantinople, which literally means the city of Constantine. The emperor did not just make it a simple garrison or a secondary metropolis. He intended to elevate this foundation to the same symbolic rank as Rome. Over time, Constantinople was adorned with official monuments, public squares, and numerous religious, civil, and military buildings. It quickly received the title of New Rome, though less in the most common official designation than in the spirit of the time. This appellation was not chosen at random. It highlighted that the city was taking up the torch of the ancient imperial capital, famed for its ancient virtues, its glory, and its centrality in the Roman world for centuries. The strategic choice of the Bosporus is not explained solely by defensive reasons or the commercial appeal of the maritime route. The geographical location also offers a remarkable natural defensive advantage as it forms a triangular promontory that protects the city on several sides, complemented by fortifications where Roman military engineers excel. Drawing on the already ancient walls of Byzantium, Constantine and his successors did not hesitate to further fortify the ramparts, adding new enclosures and ensuring the solidity of the fortified gates. Thanks to this system, Constantinople could withstand a siege for long periods, making it a safe haven for the emperor, his administration, and his treasury. Many historians, in the centuries to come, would attribute to these walls one of the main reasons for the longevity of the Eastern Roman Empire, later called the Byzantine Empire. In parallel with the birth of a new capital, Constantine undertakes a military reorganization to meet the challenges of the time. Barbarian attacks and Sassanid pressures in the east demand that armed forces be distributed more reactively. Constantine emphasizes the defense of the Danube, where the Goths and other Germanic peoples still threaten the Roman provinces. The legions, supported by auxiliary troops and the emperor's personal guards, are reorganized to be able to move quickly along the Danubian axis. The East, frequently subjected to raids by the Sasanian Empire, also benefits from reinforcement. The idea is to have mobile troops capable of containing an incursion and then counterattacking if necessary. This effort of military rationalization is accompanied by the creation of new units and closer integration of contingents recruited in distant provinces, further strengthening imperial resilience. Beyond military issues, Constantine strives to strengthen the imperial economy, which was severely tested by the monetary crises of the 3rd century. To put an end to the repeated devaluations that undermine confidence in the currency, he introduces the gold solidus, a coin that will quickly become the keystone of the Roman financial system. Minted with a relatively high gold content, the solidus remains remarkably stable. This monetary innovation helps to breathe new life into trade from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, as merchants can now rely on a reliable currency, recognized and little subject to brutal fluctuations. In many regions, this new standard will endure long after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, bearing witness to its quality and the solidity of Constantine's reform. The countryside, artisans, and merchants thus benefit from a more stable monetary unit, promoting the circulation of goods, the growth of craftsmanship, and the empire's ability to collect tax revenues in monetary form. By establishing the solidus as a pivot Constantine seeks to both assert his authority and ensure fiscal revenues, indispensable for maintaining the armies and administering a still vast empire. The burgeoning city of Constantinople, as it develops, attracts not only military and administrative elites. Merchants, artisans, architects, and scholars flock, drawn by the prospect of participating in the construction of this new center. To encourage this dynamic, Constantine does not hesitate to offer tax and land advantages to those who choose to settle there, ensuring an increasing influx of population and expertise. Wanting to make this capital a showcase, the emperor has artworks transported from ancient Greek cities, as well as statues brought back from other provinces. He officially stamps the name Constantinople on certain coins to emphasize its importance, and sumptuous buildings are erected to his glory. In this spirit, imperial palaces, baths, and a monumental hippodrome come into being, recalling the splendor of ancient Rome while paving the way for a subtle blend of Greco-Roman and Eastern influences. Among these transformations, one place particularly captures attention: the Forum of Constantine, commonly called Forum Constantini. Located not far from the administrative heart of the city, this public space reproduces to some extent the function and structure of the Roman Forum. Its purpose is to offer a gathering point for the population and to celebrate imperial power. The Forum of Constantine is adorned with colonnades, statues, and monumental gates. At the center stands an imposing column, commonly known as the Column of Constantine. Several dozen meters high, it is a strong architectural symbol, attesting to the emperor's desire to link the prestige of New Rome to the glory of the old. According to ancient testimonies, this massive column was supposedly topped by a statue of Constantine himself, sometimes described as a syncretic representation of the sovereign and the solar god Apollo. The sources vary regarding the precise iconography, but the clear intention was to elevate the emperor to the rank of divine elect, a protector endowed with celestial favor. This association with the sun, a symbol of illumination and triumph, is not unique in the Roman Empire. Already, since Aurelian, an emperor who reigned from 270 to 275, the solar cult had undergone a certain religious revival. Constantine, although he approached Christianity, still retained traditional markers intended to consolidate his power among the followers of the solar cult or other pagan currents. The column, visible from afar, then appeared as a sacred sentinel, reminding every citizen or visitor of the greatness of a sovereign who claimed to govern by the will of the gods. Over time, the Forum of Constantine became one of the nerve centers of urban life for the young capital. Ceremonies were held there, homage was paid to the emperor, and it was also an obligatory passage for official processions. The imperial processions, punctuated by offices and rituals, reinforced the sacralization of the imperial figure in the popular imagination. Gradually, basilicas, churches intended for Christian worship, and other edifices emerged, demonstrating Constantine's wish to have the legacies of Roman tradition coexist in the same city with the beginnings of a Christianity now supported by imperial authority. Through this urbanism, the empire projected an image of power, prosperity, and regained stability. In the span of a few years, Constantinople fully assumed its function as an imperial, administrative, and defensive capital. The Danube was no longer so distant thanks to an enhanced road network, and threats in the east could be addressed more swiftly. Merchant ships, laden with spices from the east, grains from Egypt, or precious goods from Asia, navigated the Bosphorus and found a safe haven in the port of the new capital, boosting its role as a crossroads between continents. The golden coin, the solidus, circulated abundantly there, encouraging bankers and merchants to establish their businesses there permanently. The mints, previously active in various provinces, benefited from this dynamic and contributed to the dissemination of the new economic system. The success of Constantinople was therefore immediate, spurred by the emperor's sustained attention and the pressing need to have a strong eastern bastion. When Constantine died in 337 Anno Domini, he left behind a city already flourishing, ready to play a major role in history. While his political and religious legacy would spark many debates, no one could deny that the founding of Constantinople and the establishment of a solid defensive, monetary, and administrative system deeply marked the destiny of the empire. In the aftermath of the death of Constantine the Great, the Roman Empire found itself plunged into a phase of recomposition of which no one could foresee the outcome. The deceased emperor, famous for having favored Christianity and founded Constantinople, left behind three legitimate sons, namely Constans I, Constans II, and Constantius II. Although each, in principle, inherited a distinct geographic area, the borders of this division remained blurred, fueling jealousies and competing ambitions. Constans I, sometimes called Constans, received Italy and North Africa, while Constans II ruled over Gaul, the Iberian Peninsula, and Great Britain. Constantius II, the eldest, obtained the east, including Egypt and Syria, but the family consensus would be short-lived. Very quickly, the collegiate system clashed with the egos and divergent interests of the brothers. Constans II, sometimes called Constantine II, believed that his younger brother, Constans I, was overstepping agreed limits and interfering with the management of Italy. In 340, he launched a military campaign to assert his authority, but Constans I's response was swift. In a confrontation near Aquileia, Constans II was killed, suddenly upsetting the initial balance. Now, Constans I held control of the entire West, while Constantius V, firmly established in the East, observed the situation from a distance. The elimination of one of the heirs made the competition even fiercer, with each fearing the loss of their sphere of domination. From 340 to 350, Constans I gradually consolidated his authority in the West. He had to manage porous borders, especially along the Rhine, where Germanic tribes sought to take advantage of Roman rivalries. Meanwhile, North Africa experienced various religious tensions related to the conflict between the institutional church and dissident movements like Donatism. The imperial centralization struggled to maintain cohesion, and the distance from Rome complicated the enforcement of laws. Despite these challenges, Constans I maintained a degree of stability, while Constantius II, in the east, consolidated his positions against potential Persian threats. Both kept a wary eye on political and military developments, fearing the rise of an internal rival. The tension escalated in 350, when the general Magnentius, of barbarian origin, proclaimed himself Augustus in Gaul. Taking advantage of the resentment among some soldiers and high-ranking officials against Constans I, he rallied a significant number of legions stationed in the north to his cause. Taken by surprise, Constans I attempted to flee, but was caught and assassinated near the Pyrenees. This resounding murder changed the dynamics, leaving Constantius II as the only legitimate successor of the lineage, while Magnentius sought to solidify his hold over the West. Supported by several Gallo-Roman elites weary of dynastic quarrels, the usurper endeavored to establish his legitimacy. However, he still had to face the counterattack of Constantius II. Aware of the danger, Constantius II gathered the best Eastern legions to march against Magnentius. The confrontation culminated in 351 at the Battle of Mursa Major on the Danube, one of the century's deadliest episodes. Despite his military capabilities, the usurper suffered a heavy defeat and had to retreat to Italy. Victorious but weakened by the losses, Constantius II pursued his opponent. In 353, with no way out, Magnentius chose to take his own life rather than be captured. From then on, Constantius II was officially the sole master of the Roman Empire. Determined to extinguish any opposition, he strengthened the central administration and intensified controls while seeking the support of bishops favorable to Nicene doctrine. Constantius II's triumph, although undeniable, was not enough to establish lasting peace. The eastern borders, in particular, caused concern as the Sassanid Empire openly expressed expansionist ambitions. In this context, the imperial court was wary of excessive concentration of power in the west, preferring to delegate authority to trusted Caesars there. With this in mind, Constantius II appointed Julian, a cousin from the same dynasty, as Caesar in 355. Related to Constantine the Great, Julian had grown up far from courtly life, cultivating a philosophic spirit marked by the Greek legacy. Sent to Gaul, he was tasked with pacifying the local provinces and restoring imperial prestige, a challenge he successfully met, despite his initial inexperience. Julian distinguished himself by securing several victories against the Alemanni, consolidating the Rhine frontier. Recognized for his competence and appreciated by the troops, he administered Gaul with rigor, reforming local taxation and encouraging the rebuilding of devastated cities. His successes quickly overshadowed Constantius II, who feared that too much prestige in the West might lead Julian to seek more independence. Moreover, Julian's religious beliefs set him apart. Although raised in a Christian environment, he had a deep interest in pagan philosophical texts and sought to reconnect with Rome's ancestral cult. This spiritual orientation, seen as an ideological challenge, fueled the emperor's mistrust, a staunch defender of a burgeoning Christianity. In 360, Constantius II demanded troops from Gaul to face the Persians, but they refused to leave Julian and proclaimed him Augustus. This move marked a rupture. The emperor contemplated confrontation, but was absorbed by the Sassanid threat. Julian's legions consolidated their position in the west, appointing new administrators and gaining the support of local elites. Faced with this dual pressure, Constantius II had no time to quell the rebellion, as the eastern situation required his full attention. Finally, in 361, death claimed Constantius II, leaving Julian without a rival. Julian, now alone in power, immediately promotes the return to the ancient gods and limits Christian influence. Nicknamed the apostate, he does not persecute the new religion, preferring to weaken it. Convinced that Rome draws its strength from its traditions, he reopens the temples and restores pagan rites. This brief phase, before his death in 363, symbolizes the last attempt to re-establish a polytheistic state, revealing the deep ideological tensions running through the empire. Between 361 and 378, Anno Domini, the Roman Empire went through a period of profound upheaval, marked by increasing tensions with external peoples, sometimes labeled as barbarians by the Romans. At that time, Rome was still divided into two major spheres of influence, notably the West, initially led by Emperor Valentinian Tharpsisch, and the East under the authority of Valens. The reign of Julian, nicknamed the Apostate, from 361 to 363, had just ended, giving way to new political and military dynamics. The central issue of these years was the more or less peaceful coexistence between the empire and neighboring peoples with contrasting ambitions. In this context, the Goths, pressured by the advance of other groups to the east, were seeking asylum from the Romans. Their official settlement south of the Danube in 376 marked the beginning of a massive reconfiguration of border balances, culminating in the Battle of Adrianople in 378. To understand the stakes surrounding the arrival of the Goths, it is necessary to look back at the political situation after the disappearance of Julian the Apostate. The latter, nephew of Constantine the Great, had been hailed by some intellectual circles for his attempt to restore traditional polytheistic cults, while others accused him of disturbing religious peace. His successor in the east, Emperor Jovian, reigned for only a few months, from 363 to 364, before giving way to the duo formed by Valentinian Thrasyllus in the west and Valens in the east. This period saw the Danube frontier remain a strategic priority for the empire, as it was exposed to incursions from numerous Germanic and Iranian tribes. Among these groups, the Goths constituted a complex confederation, composed of distinct factions sometimes referred to as the Thervings and the Gruithungs. In the mid-4th century, they were known to live on a vast territory, stretching approximately from the Black Sea to the Danube basin, in regions of forests and fertile plains. However, approaching 375, new forces emerged further east. The Huns, formidable horsemen from the Central Asian steppes, launched several lightning offensives that disrupted the local balance. Driven by this migratory push, some Gothic groups requested permission from the Roman Empire to settle legally on the other side of the Danube, hoping for imperial protection and the security of Roman provinces. In 376, Emperor Valens, eager to bolster his forces and maintain peace on his frontier, accepted the idea of welcoming the Goths on the condition that they become federates, a term designated in Latin as federati. This status implied that the newcomers would provide military troops to Rome in exchange for land and residence rights within the imperial territories. On paper, this compromise had previously proven successful for other barbarian peoples, while allowing emperors to fill certain gaps in their legions. However, the success of this mechanism greatly depended on the ability of local authorities to organize the supply, settlement, and assimilation of these thousands of people. Roman blunders quickly became apparent when corrupt and incompetent officials failed to properly distribute provisions. The Goths, instead of being settled in regions large enough to sustain them, were confined to overcrowded camps, where hunger and disease soon wreaked havoc. Under these conditions, tensions quickly exploded when the Goths, humiliated, starved, and betrayed, revolted, pillaging the surroundings and rallying other groups to their cause. The situation soon spiraled out of control, forcing Valens to mobilize a substantial army to restore order in the Balkans. It was then that one of the most significant military events of the 4th century occurred, the Battle of Adrianople, on August 9, 378. Situated in Thrace, in the current region of Edirne, Turkey, the city of Adrianople controlled important communication routes connecting Constantinople to the Balkans. Emperor Valens, eager to achieve a decisive victory, advanced with his troops without waiting for reinforcements from his nephew Gratian, the then Emperor of the West. However, the Gothic forces, led by Fritigern, were far more numerous and better organized than Valens had anticipated. Among them were not only seasoned Gothic warriors, but also survivors from other confederations, all determined not to submit. clash was devastating for the Roman legions. Ill-prepared and weakened by the summer heat, they found themselves trapped in an unexpected confrontation. The Roman cavalry, although crucial to the imperial strategy, separated from the main body, thus ceding all tactical advantage to the enemy. The Goths took advantage of this disunity and launched a destructive charge that quickly demoralized the Roman ranks. Emperor Valens, refusing to leave the battlefield, became isolated with his guards and perished in the chaos of battle. Although the exact circumstances of his death are debated by historians, his death was a shock to the confidence the empire placed in its defensive capabilities. The defeat at Adrianople had considerable repercussions throughout the empire. First, it showed that the Roman army, still believed to be invincible in many lands, could be mortally challenged by a barbarian coalition. Secondly, Valens' death created a political vacuum in the east, paving the way for a new emperor, Theodosius the Thirster, by 379. Although he only effectively took power after the battle, the reforms often associated with his reign, particularly those of the Roman army, are seen as necessary responses to the painful lessons of Adrianople. Theodosius notably sought to better integrate the Germanic peoples within the military structures of the empire. He aimed to reduce the divide between Romans and barbarians by more readily granting ranks and responsibilities to those who served loyally under the Roman standards, in hopes of avoiding another military tragedy. These changes in the composition and organization of the army were part of a broader strategy to redefine the empire's frontier policy. The Danube and Rhine frontiers remained vital, but they could no longer be defended as before, simply through fortifications and legions. From now on, diplomacy and controlled integration of the Germanic peoples became key elements in a world where population movements continued. By allowing more regular settlements and relying on military alliances with these newcomers, the emperors hoped to restore a semblance of stability. If we broaden our view to the world of the latter half of the 4th century, the Roman Empire was not the only power undergoing profound changes. In East Africa, the Kingdom of Axum, in territories partly corresponding to today's Ethiopia and Eritrea, had adopted Christianity under the reign of King Azana around 340 Anno Domini. This religious turn made Axum the first officially Christian state in Africa before even some European kingdoms. Geographically located on the trade routes linking the Red Sea, Arabia, and the interior of Africa, Axum benefited from a flourishing trade, notably in ivory, gold, and spices, providing the kingdom considerable power. Its religious and economic influence thus radiated well beyond its borders, contributing to the prestige of this state, just as imperial Rome benefited from its position at the crossroads of the Mediterranean. At the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic, on the American continent, Teotihuacan was reaching the height of its cultural and commercial influence. Located in the Valley of Mexico, this monumental city, whose name means the place where the gods were born in the Nahuatl language, was an exceptional urban center for its time, possibly gathering more than 100,000 inhabitants. The influence of Teotihuacan spread throughout Mesoamerica, thanks to trade routes that allowed for the circulation of obsidian, ceramics, textiles, and other precious goods. Structures such as the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon still bear witness today to the architectural and social sophistication of this civilization. Although there was no direct contact between Teotihuacan and the Roman Empire, these two worlds each reflected in their own way the dynamism of late antiquity civilizations. At the turn of the year 379 Anno Domini, the Roman Empire was going through a period of malaise. In this unstable context, a general of Hispanic origin, Theodosius, was called upon to take charge of the destinies of the East. Thus began the reign of the man who would later be called Theodosius III, the last emperor to rule the entire vast political territorial ensemble before its definitive division. His coronation, officially proclaimed on January 19th, took place in Sirmium, a crossroads city in the Balkans. The new emperor received the support of Gratian, who was then reigning in the West, and benefited from the legitimacy conferred by the urgent military situation. But Theodosius inherited a Danube front in crisis. His first priority was to restore peace with these populations. Through a combination of diplomatic negotiations and targeted military campaigns, he succeeded as early as 379 and 380 in repelling some rebel troops while paving the way for treaties. These agreements, known as the Feudus, offered the Goths land in exchange for military service within the Roman army. The goal of Theodosius was clear and aimed to restore stability to the borders and increase his forces by integrating these new federates. As the Gothic peril gradually dissipated, the emperor made a decision that would mark the religious history of the empire, and beyond that, permanently shape European culture. On February 27, 380, by the Edict of Thessalonica, Theodosius declared Nicene Christianity, that is, the faith formulated at the Council of Nicaea in 325, as the only state religion legitimately recognized. In concrete terms, this edict required the subjects of the empire to embrace the so-called Catholic doctrine, which aimed to unify all Christian communities under the same creed, thus excluding Arianism and other currents considered heretical. For an international audience discovering this key moment, it should be noted that Arianism, derived from the teachings of the priest Arius in the 4th century, denied the full divinity of Christ. Since the conversion of Constantine III, the question of the nature of Christ had deeply divided Christians. The Edict of 380 therefore aimed to pacify the confessional tensions by imposing Nicene orthodoxy. The authority of Theodosius also extended at the institutional level. Before him, the empire was already administered in a bicephalous manner, with an emperor in the west and another in the east. However, the lines of power often remained blurred, with each sovereign potentially clashing with a colleague or a usurper. Under Theodosius, there was a consolidation of a more structured double administration, and he appointed in the east, as well as in the west, independent praetorian prefectures, each with civil, financial, and judicial competences. The prefect of the Orient was tasked with overseeing Thrace, Asia Minor, Egypt, and the Levant, while his western counterpart administered Italy, Roman Africa, Gaul, Hispania, and, depending on the periods, Great Britain. This organization was crucial for better managing such a vast territory, especially when the military threat remained pressing. To further strengthen the unity of the Church around the Nicene dogma, he convened the Council of Constantinople in 381. This council, often considered the second ecumenical council after that of Nicaea, confirmed the Trinitarian doctrine of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and condemned the Arian positions still implanted in certain provinces. It is during this council that what is sometimes called the enigma of the imperial procession was born. According to several testimonies, Theodosius would have participated in a solemn procession preceding the theological debates. The account of this ceremony, adorned with legendary elements, oscillates between the description of an emperor in glory, bearing imperial insignia, and that of a penitent humbled before divine majesty. Contemporary chroniclers, such as Rufinus of Aquileia or Sozomen, mention contradictory details. Indeed, some insist on the magnificence of the procession, reflecting the triumph of the official faith, while others emphasize Theodosius's humility, who supposedly had his guards removed and the church adorned with modest ornaments to demonstrate his religious zeal. Historical truth remains difficult to establish, especially as this enigma is intertwined with apologetic accounts. Be that as it may, this moment illustrates the image of an emperor highly invested in the life of the church, determined to seal the alliance between the throne and the altar. After the council's closure, Theodosius returns to Constantinople, from where he administers his eastern provinces. However, he must keep a watchful eye on the west, where a new episode of turmoil is brewing. As early as 383, the usurper Magnus Maximus, proclaimed emperor by his troops in Britain, modern-day Great Britain, invades Gaul and threatens to overthrow the legitimate emperor of the West, Gratian. Maximus manages to eliminate Gratian, but still has to deal with Valentinian II, the half-brother of the late Gratian, who is barely 12 years old. Aware that a full-scale conflict could jeopardize the empire's balance, Theodosius initially opts for negotiation and recognizes Maximus as a co-ruler in certain provinces. This tactic allows him to buy time and avoid a total rupture of ties between the East and the West. However, the truce is short-lived. In 387, Maximus invades Italy, forcing Valentinian II and his mother to flee to Thessalonica. Called upon once again, Theodosius intervenes militarily. He marches against the usurper, and after several battles fought in 388, emerges victorious from this conflict. Maximus is executed, while Theodosius restores Valentinian II to the Western throne. This success reinforces the image of Theodosius as an arbiter of imperial destiny, capable of suppressing anyone who challenges legitimate authority. But the empire's troubles are not over. In 392, another contender, Eugenius, supported by the Frankish general Arbogast, rises up. Arbogast, a former auxiliary of Valentinian II, rebels after the unexplained death of the latter. Historians of the time still debate the exact circumstances of Valentinian II's death, found hanged in his apartments. Was it suicide or murder? Either way, Arbogast ensures the appointment of Eugenius, a Christian scholar who claims to rule on behalf of the Western Emperor. Once again, Theodosius is summoned to intervene to restore imperial legitimacy and prevent the West from plunging into another protracted civil war. In 394, he mobilizes his eastern troops and crosses the Alps. The decisive confrontation takes place at the Battle of the Frigidus River, now the Vipava, in Slovenia. The outcome is violent. Initially struggling, Theodosius's army is ultimately supported by a sudden shift in weather conditions, with a strong wind that hinders Eugenius's archers. The imperial soldiers eventually gain the upper hand. Eugenius is captured and executed while Arbogast's supporters scatter. According to some sources, Arbogast takes his own life while fleeing. For the second time, Theodosius has defeated a Western usurper and reunited de facto the entirety of the Roman Empire under his authority. The year 395, following this victory, marks the end of this brief reunification. On January 17, 395, after a short illness, Theodosius dies in Milan, leaving behind two still young heir sons. Although the principle of co-rule does not originate with him, Theodosius remains the one who, for the last time, exercised unique power. Under his reign, despite the division of administration, the empire was placed under a centralized imperial authority. The most crucial decisions emanated from him alone, and his prestige justified the respect of the senatorial elite, as well as military officers. In retrospect, the title of last sole emperor underscores the symbolic strength of his reign. With his death, the coordination between East and West would never again be so clear. The praetorian prefects of both halves would certainly continue to collaborate, but cultural, religious, and political distancing would increase, especially after the crises of the early 5th century. For contemporaries and posterity, Theodosius embodies both the restoration of Nicene dogma and the preservation, even if ephemeral, of Roman unity. His victories over Magnus Maximus and Eugenius, as well as the promulgation of the Edict of Thessalonica, are often cited to illustrate his pivotal role: unifier on an imperial level, conciliator on an ecclesiastical level. As for the anecdote of the Council of Constantinople and the mysterious imperial procession, it remains an ambiguous testimony to the emperor's personality. Was he a humble and pious head of state, or a monarch seeking to assert a quasi-sacred authority? Perhaps a bit of both. In an era where politics and religion were closely intertwined, Theodosius appears as the point of convergence between faith and power. His trajectory between negotiated peace with the Goths and firmness in the face of usurpers shaped the period that concludes the 4th century and prepares the inevitable separation between Greek East and Latin West. In the year 395, Anno Domini, the Roman Empire entered a period of profound upheaval. At that time, the disappearance of Emperor Theodosius III seals both the end of imperial unity and inaugurates the creation of two distinct political spheres. Theodosius is often considered the last sovereign to have reigned over the entire Roman Empire, from the west to the east. His two sons then become the heirs of a vast and complex world, already undermined by internal tensions and external threats. This event marks a major turning point, and henceforth, the unity that characterized imperial authority fractures into two poles, paving the way for divergent evolutions and the affirmation of differentiated cultural traditions. Arcadius, the eldest, inherits the eastern part of the empire. Born around 377, he is only 18 at the time of his father's death. Despite his young age, he receives a territory that many then consider more prosperous and easier to defend than the West, thanks notably to its agricultural and commercial wealth. The East, which includes among others Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and Greece, is structured around Constantinople, the former Byzantium, renamed by Constantine I a few decades earlier. Throughout the 4th century, this city has gained splendor, strengthened by its walls and its strategic geographical position on the Bosphorus, a strait that connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara. It then becomes the nerve center of Eastern imperial administration, a place where Greek influence mingles with Roman traditions. On his side, Honorius, born in 384, receives the Western Roman Empire at the age of 11. Due to his extreme youth, he is placed under the tutelage of General Stilicho, a central figure who will play a decisive role in attempting to maintain cohesion and the defense of this part of the Roman world. The West includes Italy, Gaul, Hispania, North Africa, and Britain, present-day England, but suffers from more acute problems: difficult budget balance, increasing pressures on the borders, and internal rivalries in the army. Honorius first establishes his court in Milan, which was already a major administrative capital since the late 3rd century, before relocating to Ravenna in 402. This choice results from military and strategic reasons. Indeed, Ravenna, surrounded by marshes, seems safer against imminent invasions. This new imperial residence highlights the growing fragility of the West, too exposed to the threats looming beyond the Rhine and the Danube. In this configuration, Constantinople and Milan, and later Ravenna, become distinct symbols of imperial authority. Constantinople, endowed with strong walls and significant economic resources, embodies the dynamism of an East rooted in traditions close to Hellenistic culture. Milan and later Ravenna, on the other hand, reflect the struggles of a West on the defensive, undermined by population movements, internal uprisings, and a more fragile economy. This duality of capitals reflects a now divided Roman world where, despite a superficial unity, the two sons of Theodosius exercise their power independently, even in competition. Although they ostensibly retain the same imperial titles, their political and military actions often develop without real coordination, fostering the emergence of two distinct decision-making centers. On the religious and cultural front, the division of the empire gradually accentuates a rift between the two parts. In Constantinople, the Greek language preserves its role as an intellectual and liturgical vehicle. The Eastern Church, strong in its theological tradition, develops under the influence of great thinkers and patriarchs whose authority increasingly asserts itself in political affairs. Eastern civil and religious elites find in Greek not only a means of prayer and communication, but also of legislative production and dissemination of knowledge. In contrast, the West remains attached to Latin, both for its legal texts and for its rites. Western bishops, centered on Rome and Italian cities, maintain a spiritual aura, but face constant logistical and economic challenges. This reality leads to a growing cultural gap, each region cultivating its own linguistic and spiritual identity. Administrative fragmentation accentuates military difficulties. Now, Arcadius and Honorius must manage the defense system developed by previous emperors on two fronts. However, the split makes coordination more challenging in the face of external threats, particularly those threatening from the north and east. The imperial garrisons, long organized to support a single ruler, are now divided. Furthermore, each imperial court has its own priorities, whether it's the protection of the Balkans and Anatolia for the east, or the preservation of Italy and Gaul for the West. In this uncertain context, generals acquire considerable influence since they hold the forces capable of maintaining order and repelling barbarian incursions. This evolution breeds inherent rivalries within the military hierarchy, and gradually, the autonomy of these officers will increase. Within the Western Empire, Stilicho embodies the perfect example of this rise of generals. He is a figure of Vandal origin, which already demonstrates the partial integration of some barbarian populations into the Roman military apparatus. Married to a niece of Emperor Theodosius, Stilicho enjoys both familial and strategic legitimacy. His role proves crucial for Honorius, too young to rule effectively and especially unable to face alone the crises threatening Rome and Italy. Stilicho thus concentrates considerable power in his hands. He negotiates with the Germanic federates, attempts to contain invasions in Gaul, and suppresses potential usurpations. He also takes charge of protecting the imperial court, which retreats to Ravenna whenever danger becomes too pressing. This rise of a general of foreign origin illustrates the political malleability of the empire, but also its vulnerability. The state increasingly depends on energetic and well-organized military leaders to ensure its survival. The situation is hardly simpler for Arcadius in the east. He too is subject to the influence of eminences, grises within the imperial administration. With advisors such as Rufinus, then Eutropius or Gaius, the Eastern Emperor must constantly deal with rival factions. Nevertheless, the East benefits from structural advantages. Constantinople is easier to supply, and Eastern diplomacy knows how to take advantage of long-term relations with neighboring powers such as the Sassanids. Above all, the economic prosperity of the eastern provinces, supported by Mediterranean trade and caravan routes, provides the Eastern Empire with a stronger resilience than that of the West. Despite this, Arcadius's power remains weakened by court struggles, fueled by opposition between great prefects, generals, and religious advisors, all seeking to steer imperial policy. The divergences between these actors sometimes leave the provinces poorly defended, increasing the risk of incursions or rebellions. This official division of the empire in 395 is not decreed by a single administrative act. It results rather from an hereditary division, in accordance with the will of Theodosius, who probably believed that two co-emperors close by blood would better ensure the continuity of the empire. However, in practice, institutional cohabitation facilitates the emergence of two spheres of influence, which develop their own diplomatic, cultural, and military networks. The daily challenges differ in such a way that the East focuses on the defense of Asia Minor and the stability of the vital Egyptian crescent for grain supply, while the West struggles with incursions beyond the Alps and the Rhine, fearing a collapse of its authority over Gaul and Italy. The lack of harmonious communication between Arcadius and Honorius, linked to their rival advisors, complicates the redistribution of legions in case of emergency. This lack of coordination favors the emergence of occasional crises that may eventually get out of control. This dynastic sharing, verified in 395, visibly seals an underlying movement already underway. Beyond internal borders, the chronicles of this time highlight the increasing difficulties the West faces in containing its enemies, whereas the East gradually establishes itself as a strong center, governed by dedicated high-ranking officials. The death of Theodosius, a charismatic figure who managed to maintain the illusion of a unified imperial authority, precipitates a lasting reconfiguration of the political map. On a military level, the concentration of power in the hands of leaders like Stilicho symbolizes both the necessity to rely on field expertise and the progressive fragmentation of a once centralized imperial system. Culturally, ecclesiastical Greek increasingly triumphs in Constantinople, while Latin remains the language of an administration that resists despite all odds in the West. A symbolic fracture thus begins to set in, already perceptible at the turn of the 5th century. Within the Eastern Empire, Arcadius and then his son Theodosius II maintained relatively healthy public finances thanks to an old but effective tax system. The prosperity of Antioch, Alexandria, and other eastern metropolises relies on a dense network of trade routes and the control of product flows as precious as silk, spices, and gemstones. Silk, in particular, is almost an Eastern monopoly, as Constantinople largely controls the routes to Central Asia and Persia. Merchants connected to the Silk Roads profit from the boost in exchanges between the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and far beyond. This commercial wealth feeds the imperial treasury, allowing the Eastern emperors to fund large-scale defensive constructions. Among these achievements, the wall built under the reign of Theodosius II, born in 401, and emperor from 408, embodies the new power of Constantinople. Erected between 413 and 447, this multiple fortification, composed of several enclosures and ditches, protects the city from external assaults. Thus, the eastern capital stands as an almost impregnable bastion, playing a crucial role in the future survival of this part of the empire. At the same time, Eastern diplomacy is trying to contain the threat posed by the Sassanid Empire, established in Persia, the region of present-day Iran. Heirs of the Achaemenid Persians and the Parthians, the Sassanids developed a flourishing civilization, rivaling the Roman Empire since the 3rd century. In order to avoid costly border wars, Constantinople often resorts to negotiation and the conclusion of advantageous treaties, thus avoiding the extension of conflicts. The payment of subsidies to the Persian court and the respect of limited zones of influence therefore minimized direct confrontations, allowing the Eastern Roman Empire to reserve its forces for other theaters of operations. This cautious strategy, supported by well-stocked state coffers, provides the Eastern Empire with sufficient respite to consolidate its institutions and strengthen its infrastructure. In contrast, the western part of the empire, initially led by Honorius, faces a critical financial and military context. The government of Ravenna, which gradually replaces Milan as the imperial residence for strategic reasons, finds itself weakened by the degradation of fiscal revenues. The provinces of North Africa, once Rome's breadbasket, are increasingly under pressure, while the regions of Gaul and Hispania see waves of Germanic and nomadic populations. By the end of the 4th century, various groups like the Vandals, Alans, and Suevi crossed the frozen Rhine, traditionally dated to the winter of 407, and settled in the western territories of the empire. This influx of populations, sometimes peaceful but often accompanied by looting, deeply disrupts the local administrative organization. Fiscal resources are diminished by the difficulty of collecting taxes in provinces that are half deserted or devastated, further weakening the imperial budget. The symbolic breaking point occurs in 410, when the city of Rome, the historical heart of the empire, is sacked by the Visigoths under King Alaric. Although Rome had not been the imperial residence for a century, the psychological impact of this fall resonates throughout the Roman world. In the eyes of contemporaries, the Eternal City, once the mistress of the Mediterranean, falls into chaos, marking the end of the golden age of the Pax Romana. In response to this event, Emperor Honorius's authority is more contested than ever, while local elites struggle to maintain order in the western provinces. Even as the empire seems to be disintegrating in the west, ecclesiastical structures continue to evolve in divergent directions. In the east, the Patriarch of Constantinople gradually gains prestige, buoyed by the presence of the imperial court and the region's population growth. Ecumenical councils hold a central place here, strengthening the Eastern Church's influence on doctrines. In the West, Roman primacy is theoretically exercised under the Pope's authority, the spiritual heir of the Apostle Peter. However, the political and military reality often makes it difficult to assert this spiritual power concretely over all the Western territories. Geographic distance, the fragmentation of temporal power, and the pressure of the already emerging barbarian kingdoms contribute to the Western Church evolving more autonomously, although Rome remains a powerful symbol of Christian unity. The anecdote regarding Princess Galla Placidia, known for her political influence in the first half of the 5th century, illustrates this uncertain era. Daughter of Emperor Theodosius I, sister of Honorius, and mother of Emperor Valentinian III, Galla Placidia finds herself unwillingly at the heart of negotiations with the most formidable barbarian leader of the moment, Attila, king of the Huns. In 452, as the Huns threaten to march on Italy, the Roman Senate begs Galla Placidia to intervene to negotiate some form of ransom or promise of booty. So great is the fear inspired by Attila. This episode testifies to the fragility of imperial power in the West, now compelled to bargain for peace with foreign military leaders capable of ravaging Roman territories. Politically, the East increasingly asserts itself as the core of imperial Romanity. Over the decades, the prestige and preeminence of Constantinople grow to the point that modern historians speak of the Byzantine Empire for the period after the 5th century, although the first inhabitants of this part of the world still consider themselves Romans. In the West, Romano-barbarian regna emerge, These kingdoms, born from the lasting settlement of Germanic or nomadic peoples on lands once directly administered by Rome. The Visigoths in Aquitaine, the Vandals in North Africa, and, a little later, the Ostrogoths in Italy under King Theodoric, thus lay the foundations for political entities mixing Roman traditions and barbarian customs. This often conflictual but sometimes peaceful coexistence profoundly transforms the old Roman structures of the West. Culture and the dissemination of knowledge also reflect the growing divide between the two halves of the empire. In the East, the literate tradition inherited from the Greek world is maintained, supported by rhetorical education, the presence of urban schools, and an imperial desire to preserve the Hellenic heritage. The Theodosian Code, promulgated in 438, and later the great legal compilations under Justinian, notably the Digest, the Code, and the novels, will continue to foster reflection on law and reinforce the idea of an empire governed by common laws. In Constantinople, where Greek increasingly supplants Latin, literary and theological production remains flourishing. In contrast, in the Western regions, insecurity and the decline in literacy contribute to the obsolescence or gradual disappearance of the old Roman schools, especially in Gaul. Local scholars must cope with an unstable environment, and many urban libraries end up being dispersed or destroyed. This loss of scholarly transmission accelerates the emergence of a more restricted culture, centered on the monastery, where a few monks still preserve ancient texts in scriptoria. Economically, mistrust and broken trade routes heavily affect the West. While the East continues to trade with the Near East, Egypt, and Persia, the West sees its trade routes shattered by invasions and chronic insecurity. Many rural villas, which were once important centers of agricultural production, are abandoned. There is a phenomenon of forced ruralization, in the sense that city dwellers sometimes flee the Gothic or Vandal threat to seek refuge in more remote areas. The urban fabric disintegrates, while in the East, port activity remains dynamic, supported by Egypt's surplus harvests and Constantinople's position as a crossroads. On the religious front, theological differences are emerging, heralding the major debates to come. The East and the West find grounds for doctrinal friction around the filioque. That is, the question of whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone or also from the Son, an iconoclasm which will trouble the Eastern Empire in the 8th century by questioning the legitimacy of holy images. Although these controversies do not yet lead to an official rupture in the early 5th century, they foreshadow the progressive fracturing of the churches that will culminate in the following centuries. Spiritual leadership is thus fragmented, and each half of the empire develops its doctrinal sensitivities and liturgical practices against a backdrop of mutual misunderstandings. The division of 395, while initially responding to a practical imperative to assign each son of Theodosius I a more manageable territory, proves, with the hindsight of history, to be a major turning point. It is not merely a simple dynastic succession, but instead draws a lasting dividing line between West and East, marking the birth of two political and cultural spheres that, in the centuries to come, will evolve into distinct worlds. The Mediterranean basin, until then dominated by a unified power, breaks down into a fragmented space, where the East remains a structured imperial force, soon to be labeled Byzantine, while the West crumbles into Romano-barbarian kingdoms, where the legislative heritage and the idea of an imperium persist in fragments. Differences in lifestyles, social organization, and intellectual traditions deepen, outlining the map of a medieval Mediterranean with two poles. One, centered on Constantinople, preserves Romanity in a Christianized form, reinforcing imperial authority in an urban context. The other, rooted in Italy and the former Western provinces, sees the rise of new elites, new military leaders, and peoples coming from beyond the ancient borders. Thus begins a recomposition of the Western and Eastern worlds, paving the way for a complex medieval history in which two heirs of Rome will coexist, often in rivalry, sometimes in alliance, but now leading distinctly separate destinies.